Hello, my name is Elizabeth, and on Christmas Eve, my own mother raised her glass and called me the most useless child in front of everyone. I stood there, erased from family photos, stripped from legal papers, even forced to fund my siblings while they praised her for the sacrifices I made. But the silence that night, my father's silence, my relatives' silence, cut deeper than any words. What would you do if the people you loved most not only erased you, but expected you to keep paying the price? I still remember the feeling of the cold air brushing across my cheeks as we stepped out of the car in Naperville that Christmas Eve. The neighborhood sparkled with lights strung from porch to porch, inflatable snowmen wobbling in front yards, candles glowing in windows. My fiancé squeezed my hand as we approached the wide colonial revival house my parents had lived in for decades. The place looked picture-perfect from the outside, garlands twined around the pillars, a wreath with gold ribbon on the door, warm light spilling through the bay windows. To anyone passing by, it was the image of holiday cheer. But to me, it was a house that carried equal measures of hope and dread. Walking up those steps, I told myself the same thing I had told myself every holiday since I was a teenager. Maybe this year will be different. Maybe she'll see me. I had a little mantra in my head, part prayer, part bargain. Hold your head high, keep your smile, don't let them see how much you want approval. I thought about something I once read in a family magazine. Home is where your story begins, but sometimes it's where it gets rewritten without your consent. That line stayed with me because it felt like my life, every chapter rewritten by my mother to exclude me. The door opened before I even knocked, my father greeting me with his gentle smile. He hugged me warmly, the kind of hug that made me feel like a little girl again. But I also knew he wouldn't stand between me and what was waiting inside. My fiancé carried a wrapped gift under his arm, while I clutched my purse like armor. We stepped into the familiar foyer, the scent of cinnamon and pine clinging to the air, and I braced myself. We moved toward the dining room where the table stretched nearly the length of the room, draped in a crisp white cloth, crystal glasses glittering under the chandelier. Every seat had a card placed neatly on the plate. My eyes followed them until I found mine, far at the end, beside the narrow hallway that led to the downstairs restroom. For a moment, I froze, heat creeping up my neck. That placement wasn't random. In American families, who sits where matters, the head of the table for the powerful, the center for the admired, and the edges for the expendable. The restroom seat? That was humiliation disguised as hospitality. I lowered myself into the chair, trying to smooth my dress, forcing calm into my voice. My fiancé bent close and whispered, "You deserve better than this seat." I gave him a quick smile, but inside the words pierced me. I knew it. He knew it. They all knew it. As relatives trickled in, coats draped over arms and voices carrying holiday greetings, I kept still. My place by the restroom door reminded me of being a child again, shunted to the corner while my siblings basked in my mother's spotlight. At 35, I thought I had outgrown it. Instead, here I was, still relegated to the margins. I pressed my napkin into my lap, telling myself not to overreact. Even at 35, they still make sure I know my place. The kitchen door swung open, and my mother, Sophrona, emerged in her festive apron. Her hair was perfectly styled, lipstick sharp as a weapon. She made her rounds around the table, her voice carrying warmth for everyone but me. "Aviana, that dress looks stunning," she said with a beaming smile toward my sister. "You always know how to shine." Her eyes slid past me without a word. Not a hello, not a Merry Christmas, not even the cursory small talk you give a stranger. Just a faint smirk, like acknowledgement without recognition, and then she turned to fuss over a platter of hors d'oeuvres. I forced a polite smile, though my stomach clenched. Sometimes cruelty doesn't need words. It's in the silence, in the deliberate omission. My fiancé's hand rested on mine under the table, a subtle reminder that I wasn't invisible to him. But sitting there, I felt like a ghost in my own family's story. Relatives kept arriving, slipping into chairs with murmurs of gratitude and clinking glasses. Some gave me brief nods, polite but distant, as though they'd already taken their cues from her. Nobody mentioned the seating arrangement. Nobody asked why the youngest daughter sat beside the restroom door. The avoidance was its own insult. I squeezed my fiancé's fingers, grounding myself. In my head, I coached, "Don't make a scene, just get through dinner. Smile, Elizabeth." It reminded me of an old saying, "Silence can be the loudest insult." Tonight, that silence screamed at me. Conversation swelled, Aviana recounting a recent case she won, an uncle telling stories of his business ventures, laughter rising and falling like a wave I wasn't invited to ride. My chair felt like it was on an island, removed from the warmth of the center. My fiancé tried to loop me into small side conversations, but the gulf was obvious. When appetizers were served, the sound of utensils scraping plates mixed with bursts of laughter, but my position kept me cut off, half hidden behind the constant shuffle of guests heading toward the restroom. Each time someone brushed past me, I felt the sting anew. I laughed at the right moments, smiled when expected, but inside my thoughts churned. This was just the first cut of the night. I didn't yet know how deep the blade would go. And then came the words that made every breath in the room stop. I tried to steady myself at the far end of the table, willing my body to relax into the stiff wooden chair pressed against the wall by the narrow hallway. Guests flowed in with coats draped over their arms, voices layered with the kind of holiday cheer that felt rehearsed. Laughter rippled across the dining room, clinking glasses punctuated conversations, yet I sat in a pocket of cold air near the restroom door. I adjusted the napkin in my lap and leaned slightly toward my fiancé, who had taken the chair beside me without hesitation. His hand brushed against mine under the table. "Hold your head high," he whispered. "You belong here as much as anyone else." I nodded, though my chest felt hollow. The phrase I'd read years earlier came to mind. Respect is not given, it's demanded. I repeated it silently like a lifeline, even as the sting of being sidelined grew sharper. From the center of the table, my sister Aviana's laugh rang out like silver bells, and I caught the way heads turned instinctively toward her. I forced myself to smile at a passing relative, even though I knew full well that my smile would never carry the same weight in this room. When most of the guests had arrived, I excused myself to slip toward the coat rack in the entryway. A printed list hung neatly on the wall, a way to keep track of arrivals for the big family dinner. My eyes skimmed the page out of idle habit until they landed on my own name. I froze. Elizabeth Carter. Staff. My throat tightened. It didn't say daughter, like it did for Aviana and my brother. It didn't say family. Staff. The word burned. I glanced around quickly, but no one else seemed to notice. Heat crept into my face as though a spotlight had been turned on me alone. I pressed my lips into a thin line, pasted on a polite mask, and rejoined the others. My fiancé noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked softly as I sat back down. "My name. On the guest list," I murmured, barely moving my lips. "It says staff." His eyes darkened. "That's not a mistake. Someone wanted to make a point." I kept my expression calm, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Still, the humiliation seeped into my bones. In American families, especially at gatherings like this, titles mattered. Being listed as staff was the ultimate erasure, an announcement that I was useful only as a helper, not as blood. Back at the table, the buzz of voices washed over me, a tide I couldn't quite step into. I took a sip of water, trying to bury the ache. Dinner chatter grew louder as dishes began to circulate. Sofrona's voice carried easily, warm and deliberate, and I noticed her leaning close to Leora, one of our relatives who always sat near her like an eager confidant. I wasn't meant to hear it, but she didn't lower her tone enough. "She's always been the difficult one," Sophrona murmured, shaking her head in mock sadness. "Never satisfied, never grateful." The words sliced through me, not because they were new, I had heard variations of them my whole life, but because she planted them there, in Leora's ear, knowing full well that I would catch it. This was her craft. Character assassination dressed as casual comment, poison disguised as concern. I sat frozen, my fork hovering above my plate. My fiancé noticed immediately, slipping his hand over mine, squeezing gently. I forced myself to chew, though each bite tasted like ash. In my head, the thought crystallized. It's not what she says. It's how she plants doubt in others' minds. How she erases me in plain sight and then tells the story so convincingly that everyone believes her version. The ache gave way to anger. I scanned the table. Some relatives nodded faintly, lips pursed in agreement. Others avoided my eyes, choosing silence over confrontation. And nobody defended me. In this family, silence wasn't peace. It was consent. I looked down at my plate, my inner voice biting. How many times have they heard her call me difficult? How many times have they believed her? The realization settled heavy. This was not a slip of the tongue. This was decades of training, her words, their silence, my erasure. I cut into the ham on my plate, each slice deliberate, my jaw tightening with every chew. The din of laughter and storytelling continued around me, as if nothing had happened. My fiancé leaned close again, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to take this forever." I placed my fork down, exhaled slowly, and whispered back, "I know. And tonight, I won't." Humiliation dressed in Christmas cheer was worse than outright cruelty. It wrapped itself in ribbons and carols, impossible to confront without looking like the one who ruined the evening. But something inside me shifted as I sat there, invisible at the end of the table. They thought I would stay quiet. They were wrong. The dining room hummed with the sound of cheerful conversation, forks scraping against china, and bursts of laughter that seemed almost rehearsed. To anyone looking in, it would appear to be the perfect Christmas Eve. Family gathered, glasses sparkling under the chandelier, the tree glowing in the corner. To me, it was a stage where the roles had already been cast, and mine had been written to disappear. I tried to distract myself from the sting of the staff label on the guest list and the words my mother had whispered about me being difficult. I pressed a smile onto my face, though my stomach felt tight. My fiancé leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. "Don't let them write your story for you," he murmured. I nodded, even though it felt like the story had already been edited long ago. I told myself I could survive the evening if I kept quiet, if I stayed in my chair and swallowed every slight. Still, a thought circled my mind like a warning. In families like mine, erasure doesn't happen all at once. It begins with small accidents, except they're never accidents. "Everyone come to the living room!" Sophrona's voice cut through the chatter, commanding attention as naturally as breathing. "I've prepared a little slideshow, memories of our family through the years." Chairs scraped back and people moved eagerly toward the living room, balancing glasses of wine. I followed, slower, trying to prepare myself. Maybe, I thought, this could be my chance. Maybe the slideshow would show me woven into the story. Maybe she would let me exist, if only in pictures. The lights dimmed, and the large flat screen flickered to life. Soft piano music filled the background. A photograph appeared, my brother in his white coat, smiling with a stethoscope around his neck. Applause broke out. Then Aviana in her cap and gown, shaking hands with Adine. More cheers. I waited, breath caught in my throat, for a photo of me, a birthday, a graduation, a vacation, anything. The next slide appeared. It was the whole family at a beach, arms around one another, waves crashing in the background. But something was wrong. My spot on the end of the row, where I remembered standing, was cropped out. I wasn't there. Another photo. Thanksgiving dinner years ago. I remembered clearly carving the turkey that year. But in the photo, the image cut off at the carving station. The smiling faces around the table remained, while I had been erased from the frame. My chest constricted. It wasn't a mistake. My absence was deliberate. "Wow, Mom, this is beautiful," Aviana gushed, leaning forward. "You really captured our story." Silence from me. I clamped my jaw shut, forcing the sting to stay behind my teeth. Inside, my voice whispered, "This isn't an oversight. This is a rewriting of history. My presence has been deleted, and the story is cleaner without me." And in American families, slideshows and albums are sacred. They hold proof of belonging. To be cut out was more than insult. It was symbolic death. The music faded as the slideshow ended. Sophrona turned casually toward me, wineglass in hand, her voice light but aimed like an arrow. "At least Aviana gives us achievements to show," she said, gesturing toward my sister. "Elizabeth just plays with ads. We gave her something to do so she wouldn't feel useless." The words landed with the same weight as a slap. A few relatives chuckled awkwardly. Others dropped their eyes to their plates, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. I felt my fiancé tense beside me, his body shifting as if he might speak, but I pressed my hand onto his, firm. "Not yet." Inside, my thoughts raced. She doesn't see my work as real. 3 national campaigns, a team of colleagues who count on me, revenue measured in millions, and still, in her mouth, I'm playing with colors. I recalled a line I once underlined in a self-help book. "The worst loneliness is not being alone, but being with people who make you feel invisible." That was me, standing in the middle of my own family, unseen. I forced myself to keep my face neutral, though humiliation sharpened into anger underneath. As I sipped my wine, my mind drifted through the years. Late nights bent over a laptop, skipped vacations, the pride of leading a team, and launching campaigns that made headlines, all minimized with a sentence. My siblings had their applause, their endless trophies. Aviana the lawyer, always praised for her sharp mind. My brother the surgeon, exalted as if he had saved the world with every operation. And me, the one who paid the bills when the mortgage was late, the one who wrote checks for hospital copays, the one who quietly sent money for Aviana's exam prep. None of that was ever spoken aloud. Pride had never once been extended to me. The truth hit harder than the wine. My pain tonight wasn't about the slideshow or a single sentence. It was about years of being minimized, erased whenever recognition mattered most. This family needs me when the bills are due, but when pride is on the line, I don't exist. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the liquid cling to the sides. My fiancé leaned closer, his voice a steady whisper. "One day, Elizabeth, you'll have to show them who you are." I turned slightly, meeting his eyes. My own voice came out quiet but unwavering. "Not one day. Soon." I tilted the glass back, swallowing the last sip, the taste of bitterness coating my tongue. And it wasn't long before the cracks in their perfect facade began to show. Dinner resumed after the slideshow ended, though for me the taste of food had already soured. Platters made their way around the table again. Drinks were refilled, and the conversation picked up as if nothing had happened. My siblings leaned easily into stories of work and travel, voices smooth, commanding attention. I sat at the far end, trying to keep my breathing steady, still reeling from the way my face had been edited out of our family history. My fiancé leaned toward me, his whisper gentle but edged with truth. "Elizabeth, they're not going to stop." I gave the smallest of nods. He was right. My mother hadn't held back in mocking my career, and I knew another cut was coming. My hands tightened around my napkin, folded and unfolded in my lap. I told myself to keep calm, though my patience was fraying. Silence may look like strength, but in this family, it has always been my cage. The clinking of glasses signaled that Aviana was about to speak. She raised her wine high, her voice clear, calculated to carry. "I just want to take a moment," she began, "to thank Mom for everything she's done for me. Law school was brutal, and the bar exam even more so. But Mom made sure I had everything I needed, the prep courses, the tuition, every expense covered. I truly wouldn't be where I am today without her sacrifices." Applause rose around the table. Uncles nodded, aunts smiled, cousins murmured admiration. Sophrona sat straighter, accepting the praise like it was her due. I felt my jaw lock, heat rising behind my ears. Every word my sister spoke dug deeper because I knew the truth. It hadn't been Sophrona who paid for Aviana's exam prep or the tuition shortfalls. It had been me. I remembered the bank app open on my phone, my finger hovering before transferring thousands of dollars I could have used to finally replace my car. I remembered the nights spent calculating budgets, trimming back dinners out, shelving vacations. Also, Aviana could stand there now and toast my mother as the savior. Aviana's glass sparkled under the light as she added, "Mom, you've always been so selfless. That's what mothers do." The room echoed with agreement. Sophrona gave a demure smile, accepting the compliment, though her eyes flicked briefly toward me with something closer to triumph. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. Every nerve screamed to call out the truth, but I kept my hands folded tight. They're building her pedestal out of my sweat, and I'm still the one called useless. I looked across at my father. He sat at the head of the table, hands resting beside his plate, eyes lowered. He didn't nod along, but he didn't correct the lie either. I watched him carefully, searching for any sign of resistance. Nothing. He kept his gaze fixed on his food, his lips sealed as though cemented. The silence from him weighed heavier than any insult. He knew. He had watched me wire the money, had seen me shoulder responsibility, and still he said nothing. His silence is louder than her words, I thought. He has seen the transfers. He knows the truth. And still he says nothing. A line I'd once heard surfaced in my memory. "Evil triumphs when good men do nothing." Edmund Burke's words, quoted often in American classrooms and pulpits. Tonight, they fit like a knife against bone. Sadness welled in me, but it hardened into something sharper. My father wasn't just weak, he was complicit. He let her wield her power unchecked, and in doing so, he betrayed me. I realized I was gripping my wine glass so tightly, my knuckles were white. My fiancé laid his hand over mine gently, steadying me, reminding me not to shatter the glass in my fury. His quiet support kept me tethered, but inside my mind spun fast, sharp as broken glass. She calls me useless, I thought, each sentence a beat of anger. She erases me from photos. She steals my sacrifices to glorify Aviana. And my own father lets it happen. Frustration pressed against my chest until it felt hard to breathe. Around me, the chatter rose and fell, oblivious to the storm building inches away. I tried to swallow it, to hold the line a little longer, but the weight of it pressed heavier with every second. People often mistake silence for peace. They think the absence of argument means harmony, but silence can be a weapon, just as cutting as words. In this family, silence wasn't the balm that held us together. It was the glue that sealed the cracks so no one would have to face the truth. I realized then that I was near the edge. One more wound, One more deliberate strike, and I wouldn't be able to hold myself back. I wasn't sure what would come out when I finally broke, but I knew it would change everything. The conversation flowed on, relatives laughing, complimenting Aviana, raising their glasses again, the sound of silverware tapping rhythmically against china. They carried on as if nothing at all was brewing at the end of the table. My fiancé bent closer again, his voice low but steady. Elizabeth, when the time comes, don't hold back. I nodded, staring down at the tablecloth, my mind sharpening into a kind of resolve I hadn't felt before. Tonight, I whispered, more to myself than to him, I will not leave this table the same person I was when I sat down. And the next strike would shatter whatever was left of my patience. The main course arrived with a flourish, platters of roast beef, bowls of mashed potatoes, and steaming trays of green beans were passed down the table. Laughter grew louder, conversation overlapped, and for a moment it looked like every other holiday dinner I'd endured. I cut into my food, each bite deliberate, forcing myself to chew while the humiliation of Aviana's toast about her tuition and my father's silence still pressed against my ribs. I glanced at him again. He remained quiet, sipping his wine, eyes fixed on nothing. The words he refused to speak were heavier than any insult my mother had hurled at me. My fiancé leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. They're using your silence against you, he whispered. He was right. Every time I swallowed my protest, Sophrona claimed more ground, rewrote more of my place in this family. In American culture, children are taught to respect their parents, but respect without reciprocity is not respect, it's submission. I repeated the thought silently, my pulse rising. As the dishes cleared, Sophrona turned toward me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone carried across the table, sharp as glass. Elizabeth, she said, as though addressing an assistant, clear the plates, please. You know how to keep busy. The room shifted. Forks stilled. No one else was asked to help. The command was reserved for me. I felt every eye glance my way before sliding quickly away. Aviana smirked into her glass of wine, her lips twitching with satisfaction. A cousin coughed to cover a laugh. My fiancé stiffened beside me. You don't have to do this, he murmured, gripping my wrist gently. But the silence around me pressed like a weight. My inner voice whispered, I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even family. I was the help. I rose slowly, each step toward the first plate, a chain tightening around my ankles. The clatter of china filled the void as I gathered dishes, weaving between chairs while others kept their conversations going, determined to act as though this wasn't a spectacle. But I felt it. I was on display. When I reached the kitchen, I set the plates down with more force than necessary, willing myself not to shatter them. I stood there a moment, breathing deeply before returning. To refuse would have been defiance. To obey was humiliation. Either way, Sophrona won the round. I slid back into my chair, heart pounding. I caught sight of my fiancé's face, tight with anger, but I shook my head slightly. Not yet. Dessert followed shortly. Cheesecakes and tarts carried out as if nothing had happened. Aviana clapped her hands lightly, standing to present a gift. Mom, I wanted to give you something special, she said, producing a neatly wrapped envelope. She handed it across the table with a flourish. Sophrona opened it, pulling out a certificate for an expensive spa package. Gasps of delight circled the table, and applause followed. Relatives leaned in, praising her thoughtfulness, complimenting Sophrona for raising such a generous daughter. But I knew the truth. The money for that gift hadn't come from Aviana. Weeks earlier, she'd come to me, her voice sugar-sweet, asking for a temporary loan until her next paycheck cleared. I had transferred the funds, knowing even as I did it that repayment would never come. And now here she was, basking in the glow of generosity purchased with my sacrifice. "Mom, you deserve this," Aviana said, voice ringing with sincerity. "You've always given us everything." Sophrona pressed her hand to her chest, smiling proudly. "It's because my children give me pride." The words landed like stones. I felt my fiancé's hand cover mine under the table, his thumb pressing into my palm, grounding me. He knew. He remembered the night I wired the money, the hesitation on my face before pressing send. Not only do they erase me, I thought, they build Aviana's pedestal with my money. I smiled thinly at the performance, but inside betrayal curdled into something sharper. The urge to speak rose like fire in my throat, only barely contained. I thought of every unseen contribution, the bills I covered when the roof leaked, the emergency funds I provided when the car broke down, the quiet checks I wrote while they praised each other's accomplishments. Respect wasn't about money, but respect disappeared fastest when you were treated like an ATM. I heard the echo of another American saying, "Family is supposed to have your back, not break it." But here, each moment tonight was proof that my back had been the foundation for their comfort, their pride, their applause, and none of it bore my name. I glanced around the table again. To them, I was still just the girl at the end near the restroom, the one tasked with dishes, the one erased from photos, the one mocked for her career. The pattern was undeniable. Each slight wasn't random, it was orchestration, erasure, packaged as tradition. I clenched my fists in my lap, pressing my nails into my palms. My heart pounded, breath shallow, fury controlled only by will. My fiancé leaned closer once more, his voice steady. "You're stronger than they realize." I turned to him, my whisper firm. "And soon, they'll find out." Because the next humiliation wouldn't just sting, it would ignite. We had all just returned to our seats after dessert was served, the plates of tarts and cheesecakes barely touched before conversation resumed its hum. The air felt heavier now, layered with tension I couldn't quite shake. Sophrona sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, chin lifted as though the room itself was hers to command. She tapped her glass lightly, and the sound cut through the chatter like a bell. I knew something was coming. I felt it in the way she surveyed the table, measuring each of us like pieces on a board. My fiancé must have sensed it too, because he squeezed my hand firmly under the table. "Brace yourself," he whispered, his voice low enough for only me to hear. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach tightened. In families like mine, praise for some always comes at the expense of others. I had seen it countless times before. The spotlight never spread evenly, and the warmth of recognition always left a shadow meant for me. Tonight, I felt that shadow stretching, preparing to swallow me whole. The tension pulled across the table like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. Sophrona stood, glass raised high, her smile wide and gracious as she turned to address the room. "Family," she began, her tone like silk, practiced and warm. The chatter fell away immediately. Every eye turned toward her. She began with Aviana, her voice glowing with pride. "My daughter, the brilliant attorney, winning cases that seemed unwinnable, making her mark in the courts." The room erupted in applause, clinking glasses, smiles directed toward Aviana as she blushed and lowered her head modestly, though her grin betrayed her satisfaction. Next, Sophrona shifted seamlessly to my brother. "And my son, the surgeon, saving lives every single day. A gift to this world, a man whose work is nothing short of noble." Again, cheers rose around the table, and my brother nodded, soaking in the recognition with quiet dignity. I clapped politely along with the others, though my palms barely touched. My chest tightened with each word, waiting. Hope and dread tangled in me like threads knotted together. Maybe this time she'll surprise me, I thought. Maybe just once she'll say she's proud of me. My fiancé looked at me, doubt in his eyes, but no words on his lips. He didn't believe she would, but I still clung to that small, fragile hope. The silence that followed was thick with expectation. Sophrona turned, her glass still raised, her smile thinning as her eyes found mine. When she spoke again, her voice sharpened, losing its silk, cutting clean through the room. "And of all my children," she said clearly, loudly enough for every guest to hear, "Elizabeth is the most useless, always chasing silly ideas, never quite enough." The words landed like stones dropped into water, ripples spreading instantly. The entire table froze. Forks hovered mid-air, laughter choked off mid-breath. My chest burned as if struck. Heat rose up my neck, a lump swelling in my throat. I looked around the table, desperate for an anchor. Aviana smirked faintly, her lips curling in a satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. My father stared fixedly at his plate, refusing to look up, his silence pressing like a second blow. A few relatives exchanged quick, awkward glances, their discomfort plain, but not a single word came to my defense. Beside me, my fiancé's grip tightened around my hand, his jaw clenched, fury flashing in his eyes. It wasn't just the insult, I thought. It was the public execution of my worth. The room seemed to spin in slow motion, every detail seared into my mind. The glint of the chandelier above, the untouched cheesecake slices, the flickering of candles, all suspended in the suffocating silence of her words. Americans often say, "Some wounds don't bleed, but they kill you just the same." That was what this felt like. A death by humiliation, my identity stripped not in private whispers, but in front of every pair of eyes that mattered. Seconds stretched like minutes. No one spoke. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me until it felt difficult to breathe. Every gaze lingered, waiting to see what I would do. Would I cry? Would I laugh it off? Would I let the words hang, unchallenged, until they became truth etched into memory? Humiliation in private hurts, but humiliation in public defines you, unless you fight back. My fiancé leaned in, his voice urgent, low. "Elizabeth, you don't have to take this." I inhaled deeply, air rushing into lungs that felt compressed for too long. Something inside me shifted, snapping free from the chains of silence I had carried all my life. No more silence. I placed my napkin gently on the table, every movement deliberate, measured, as though time itself had slowed. My hands didn't tremble. My voice inside my head was steady and cold. "This is the last time she'll call me useless without consequence." I looked up, my eyes meeting hers, and I felt the fury sharpen into clarity, because the very next words out of my mouth would flip the entire table upside down. The silence after my mother's toast clung to the room like a fog. Every eye was fixed on me, waiting for the expected reaction, a tearful retreat, maybe a nervous laugh to smooth over the sharpness of her words. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, but instead of shrinking, I slid my napkin from my lap, folded it with care, and placed it on the table. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor echoed like a challenge in the stillness. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate. I knew I had their attention now. Their certainty that I would swallow this insult was already crumbling. My fiancé brushed my hand with his fingers, a silent gesture that said, "Go ahead, I'm with you." The room shifted. The smug certainty that had followed my mother's words gave way to tense anticipation. No one expected me to fight back. And yet, there I was, standing tall at the far end of the table, refusing to break. I met Sophrona's eyes, my voice steady and cold. "Then stop calling me when you need money." Gasps rippled across the room like a wave. Aviana's smirk faltered, her glass lowering slightly. My mother's lips tightened, but before she could respond, I continued. "Because that's what I am to you, isn't it? An ATM, the one you call when the mortgage is late, when medical bills come due, when tuition fees are hanging over your head. You never call to ask how I'm doing, never call to say you're proud, only when you need. Elizabeth, Sophrona snapped, her tone sharp. Don't be ridiculous. No, I shot back, my voice louder now, stronger. Let's be honest for once. I let my gaze sweep across the table, locking eyes with each relative as I spoke. Do you want examples? Car payments? 18 months of them. Hospital bills, when Dad had his surgery, tuition for Aviana's bar exam prep, thousands of dollars wired directly from my account. And that's just a start. My mother's face tightened, but she stayed silent. My inner thought pulsed like a drum. If she wants to strip me of dignity, I'll strip away her lies. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The TV in the dining room was still connected from the slideshow earlier. My fingers moved quickly, connecting the device. Within seconds, the room filled with the bright glow of the screen, and everyone's heads turned. The first screenshot appeared. My banking app, transaction history in plain detail. March 14th, I said clearly. Property tax, $1,500. June 22nd, roof repair, $3,000. December 5th, emergency dental, $800. All me. I tapped to the next slide. April 7th, hospital copay. September 10th, car repairs. October 3rd, Aviana's bar exam prep, nearly $2,000. Every single one of these transfers came from me. The room buzzed with shocked murmurs. Aviana's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without words. I thought Dad paid for that, she said finally, her voice thin. I turned toward her. No, that was me, the sister who apparently just plays with ads, the one Mom calls useless. The silence that followed was crushing. Everyone knew what it meant, that the pedestal Aviana stood on had been built with my money, my sacrifices. My father's hands trembled on the table, his knuckles pale, but still he said nothing. He stared down at his plate, the same silence that had betrayed me again and again. Sophrona finally laughed, though it was brittle. Elizabeth, she offered, it was her choice. She's exaggerating. I cut her off, my voice like steel. No. You begged. You cried. You told me you didn't know what you'd do if I didn't help. I gave because I believed family meant something. That's not choice, that's manipulation. Gasps filled the room again. Relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my gaze, others whispered behind their hands. The weight of the evidence pressed down like a storm cloud. I let the silence stretch, savoring the discomfort. Then I straightened my shoulders, voice calm but powerful. You call me useless while living off what I provide. Tell me, what's more useless? The one who pays, or the ones who pretend the help doesn't exist? The balance had shifted. Sophrona no longer looked victorious. She looked cornered. Aviana stared at me, pale and shaken. My father sat hollow, his silence damning him more than her words. I stood firm, refusing to sit back down, my fiancé's hand resting firmly on my back, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of humiliation sliding off my shoulders and landing squarely where it belonged. And I wasn't finished yet, because this was only the first strike. The glow from the TV still painted the walls, illuminating every stunned face in the dining room. The screenshots of my bank transfers scrolled in silence, each number hammering at the illusion my mother had so carefully built. Sophrona stiffened in her chair, lips pursed, but she said nothing. For the first time that evening, she seemed unsure of herself. I remained standing, my pulse steady, my voice echoing in the silence I had created. Every relative was watching me now, their gazes torn between disbelief and reluctant recognition. My fiancé leaned slightly toward me, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. You've got them listening now. I gave the smallest nod. He was right. For years, my voice had been swallowed whole by their indifference. Tonight, it was finally resonating in the very room where it had been muted most often. The balance of power was shifting, slowly, unsteadily, but I felt it. Yet resistance lingered like a shadow, waiting to strike. Wait, what? Aviana's voice broke through the silence, high-pitched and wavering. She stared at the glowing numbers on the screen, confusion flickering across her perfect mask. You paid my bar prep? Her hand slipped, and the silver fork she held clattered against her porcelain plate with a sharp, ringing clang. The sound echoed through the silence like a gunshot. Gasps erupted around the table. Every head turned to her, then back to me. Yes, Aviana, I said, my tone cutting, controlled. Your bar prep, your exam fees, all of it covered by me. Her face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing like a child caught in a lie. I thought, Mom. No, I cut in, refusing to let her finish. Not Mom. Me. Relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some leaned back as if to distance themselves from the tension. Others leaned forward, riveted by the spectacle. Aviana's eyes darted towards Sophrona, searching for rescue, but my mother stayed silent, her face hardening. The shame rippled across Aviana's features as realization set in. For all her crowing, her pedestal had been carved from my sacrifice. My voice rose, steady and clear. For years, I've been the one propping this family up. You paraded your accomplishments while I quietly footed the bill, and not once did anyone here stop to ask what it cost me. The air was brittle, fragile with tension. That was when a cousin at the far end muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "She's overreacting. This is just drama." Another relative added under their breath, "Why bring this up now in front of everyone?" The whispers spread quickly, a tide threatening to drown the truth I had laid bare. Sophrona seized her chance, raising her hand as if conducting a choir. "See?" she said, her voice smooth, triumphant. "She always makes everything about herself. Even tonight, even at Christmas." My heart pounded, but I forced my voice to remain calm, measured. "No, this isn't about me making a scene. This is about truth you've all ignored because it was easier to believe her lies." Sophrona opened her mouth, but I didn't let her reclaim the floor. "You've built this perfect image by silencing me, by twisting stories, by letting everyone think I'm the weak one. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you whisper over it." A line I had read once rose in my memory. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." James Garfield's words, spoken long ago, fit the moment like a blade. "So maybe tonight feels miserable," I continued, scanning the faces around the table. "But it's also the first time any of you are hearing what's real." The room trembled with discomfort. Some relatives leaned into each other, whispering still, but their tones were softer now, less certain. I took a step closer to the TV, scrolling deliberately through more evidence, screenshots of transfers, Sophrona's text messages, every request she'd ever made. Dates, amounts, her name attached again and again. "There," I said, pointing. "Look for yourselves." She called me crying about the roof, about property taxes, about emergencies that somehow always landed in my lap, and I gave, every single time. The whispers began to fade. Slowly, inexorably, heads turned, not toward me, but toward her. Sophrona's posture faltered, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to fear. Meridian, one of the few relatives who had always carried a quiet sympathy for me, finally broke the silence. She nodded, her voice firm. "She's right. I've seen those transfers before. Elizabeth isn't lying. The effect was instant. The room's weight shifted. For the first time in years, the silence that usually smothered me wrapped itself around my mother instead. Sophrona sat rigid, her knuckles white against the stem of her glass, but she couldn't stop the tide. The silence grew, not against me this time, but against her. I raised my chin, letting the moment breathe, savoring the shift in power that had taken decades to arrive. My father shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling slightly on the table, but as always, he said nothing. "This isn't over," I declared, my voice steady, strong. "Tonight, you will hear every truth you've buried." The words landed like a gavel. Sophrona's face tightened, her control slipping visibly. The walls of her perfect story were beginning to crack, and everyone at the table could see it. And the next truth would be the one she feared most. The dining room had gone still. After the murmurs from my relatives tapered off, the quiet stretched so long it felt like we were all holding our breath. Every gaze shifted toward Sophrona, and for the first time that night, I saw her confidence crack. Her shoulders stiffened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. My fiancé leaned close, his voice low but urgent. "They're listening now. Don't stop." I straightened, drawing strength from the weight of his hand on my back. This was the moment I had been bracing for, the one she had feared most. This was the truth she worked hardest to bury. I walked toward my bag, resting neatly by the sideboard, and pulled out a thick folder I had carried for months, documents I prayed I would never have to show. I held them tightly, then crossed back to the TV, where the slideshow had once erased me. "Let's look at something else," I said evenly, my voice steady in the silence. I connected my phone again, this time scrolling to scans of legal papers. On the screen, the first image appeared, a deed dated 2016. "This is the house," I said, pointing. "Our family home. My name clearly listed as co-owner." I flipped to the next image, dated 2018. "And this is the revised deed. Notice anything missing?" I waited, scanning the room. My name vanished. Gasps spread across the table. Aunts leaned forward, cousins squinted at the screen. A murmur swelled, disbelief mingled with shock. Sophrona tried to interject, her voice sharp. "You don't understand the legal details." "No, Mom," I cut her off, my tone like steel. "I understand betrayal written in black and white." I flipped through more pages. Trust amendments, will revisions, property records, all scrubbed of me as though I had never existed. This wasn't oversight. This was deliberate. A systematic erasure, not just from photos, but from legacy. The betrayal cut deep, but as I laid it bare, I felt my spine straighten. My humiliation no longer weighed me down. It sharpened me. The silence grew heavier. Relatives shifted in their seats, eyes darting between Sophrona and the screen. Meridian, who had always treated me kindly, finally spoke, her voice steady. "I've seen those papers before. She's telling the truth." The weight of her words dropped like a stone. Ignatia, who had earlier muttered that I was overreacting, dropped her gaze, shame coloring her cheeks. Aviana stared, pale, her lips parted in disbelief. The pedestal beneath her shook as she realized the story she'd lived on was built on lies. My father lowered his face into his hands, trembling. He didn't speak, not yet, but his silence carried the weight of guilt. Vindication welled in me, painful and freeing all at once. For years I had carried this truth alone, doubting my own worth, believing their version of me. Now, finally, the evidence spoke louder than her whispers. Property and inheritance, in America, are more than possessions. They are legacy, proof of belonging, the way families mark who is honored and who is discarded. And I had been discarded, erased by the very woman who should have protected me. Sophrona's mask finally cracked. Her voice rose, shrill. This is family business. She's airing dirty laundry in front of everyone. Relatives exchanged looks, judgment etched on their faces, not toward me, but toward her. I met her gaze, calm and steady. No, you made it family business when you erased me and called me useless. Tonight, everyone sees the truth. Her lips trembled, fury spilling out. Ungrateful! You were always ungrateful! But her words rang hollow now. The weight of evidence crushed her fury, stripping it of power. She lashed out, but it was too late. The damage was done, and no one rushed to her defense. For years her voice had filled every silence, but now the silence belonged to me. My father finally lifted his head, his voice breaking as it scraped out of his throat. Sophrona. His eyes glistened, full of regret and fear. Is it true? Did you really erase her? The room stilled completely. Every eye fixed on her. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time, Sophrona faltered, speechless. My chest rose with a mix of sorrow and vindication. The father who had stayed silent too long had spoken, but the words had come too late. And for the first time, my father's silence shattered. But the damage was already done. The TV still glowed with the property documents, the names and dates burned into the eyes of everyone at the table. Murmurs rippled through the room, an uncle shaking his head, an aunt whispering, "Unbelievable!" as if the truth were too heavy to swallow all at once. I stood tall, my chest rising with the kind of steadiness that only comes after years of being pushed into silence. Beside me, my fiancé leaned close, his voice firm but encouraging. This is the moment. She can't hide anymore. I nodded, my gaze locked on my mother. Sophrona sat rigid at the head of the table, her jaw so tight I could see the muscles straining. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but for the first time in decades, she found none. Every relative waited, breath suspended, for someone, anyone, to break the stalemate. This was it, I thought. The truth she buried for years is finally choking her in the open. My father lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders trembled, and when he finally lifted his face, he looked older than I had ever seen him. His voice cracked like brittle wood. Sophrona, is it true? Did you erase her? The room froze. You could hear the clock ticking in the hall, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Every eye locked on my mother, waiting for her answer. She hesitated, her voice stammering. It was for the family. She didn't need— Answer me! My father shouted, louder than I had ever heard him. His fist trembled against the table. Did you erase her? Silence pressed down, thick and suffocating. He shook his head, voice breaking again. I should have spoken years ago. His eyes glistened, tears brimming at the edges. I saw what was happening. I told myself it was easier to keep the peace. But peace built on silence is a lie. Inside, I felt a surge of pain tangled with bitter validation. Finally. But too late. He acknowledged what I had lived with all my life, not only the betrayal of my mother, but the betrayal of his silence. And then it came. A voice from the far side of the table, piercing the fragile quiet. Leora, a distant relative with more candor than tact, blurted out, I thought she wasn't your daughter. The words exploded in the air, drawing gasps and horrified looks. My chest burned, my pulse racing. So this was what my mother had told them, that I wasn't hers, that I didn't belong. The humiliation was no longer just private, no longer whispered in kitchens or layered into sighs. It had been broadcast, absorbed, believed. I steadied myself, anger overtaking the tears threatening to surface. So that's what you've been telling people? I demanded, my voice cutting through the tension. That I don't belong? Sophrona flinched, her composure cracking further. They misunderstood, she said quickly, but her tone wavered. No, I said, my words sharp and clear. They believed exactly what you wanted them to believe. Every gaze in the room shifted back to her, judgment now heavy on her shoulders. In American families, reputation within the extended circle is currency, and she had spent mine to buy her illusion of perfection. To be stripped of it was to suffer a second erasure. The collapse of her authority was visible. Relatives no longer looked at me as though I were the problem. They looked at her, eyes narrowed, lips tight. Aviana's complexion paled, the pedestal she stood on reduced to rubble. Sophrona tried desperately to claw back control. This is not the place for this conversation, she declared, her voice brittle but commanding. I leaned forward, my voice calm but implacable. You made it the place when you called me useless in front of everyone. You made it the place when you erased me from papers, from photographs, from your stories. Gasps filled the room again, but now they carried agreement, not shock. The tide had shifted. Sophrona's authority, once absolute, cracked under the weight of evidence and the glares of those who had believed her for years. My father lowered his head, shame radiating off him. He didn't defend her, not this time. He couldn't. The silence that had once betrayed me now turned its blade toward her. I drew in a long breath, feeling decades of oppression lifting, replaced by a fire I had no intention of extinguishing. I looked straight at her, my voice cold and steady. You erased me on paper. You erased me in your words. But you will never erase the truth again. The room remained utterly silent. No one dared to defend her. No one dared to deny me anymore. Because the next step wasn't about exposing lies. It was about ending them for good. The dining room stayed suspended in a tense quiet after the outsider's words had ripped through the air. Sophrona's authority, once so absolute, so carefully maintained, was in tatters. She sat rigid in her chair, her eyes darting around as if still searching for an ally. None came. My father looked broken, his hands trembling where they rested on the table, his head bowed in shame. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, whispers weaving through the air like cracks in plaster. My fiancé leaned close, his hand brushing mine in a grounding touch. "End it on your terms," he whispered, steady as ever. I drew in a breath, slow and deliberate, and let it fill me with clarity. Yes, this is where I draw the line forever. For years, anger had been my companion, but now anger was gone. What remained was resolve, cold, calm, unshakable. I would not allow her to write the last chapter of me. That privilege belonged to me alone. I reached for my purse, the leather strap cool under my hand, and pulled out a plain white envelope. With a firm gesture, I placed it in the center of the table. The sound of paper on wood was louder than it should have been, startling in the silence. "What is this?" Sophrona's voice cracked, disbelief lacing her words. I met her gaze. "Inside," I said clearly, "is the last check you'll ever cash from me." Gasps rippled around the table. Aviana froze, her eyes wide. My father lifted his head slightly, grief clouding his expression. Sophrona's lips parted, but no words came. I let the silence linger a moment longer before speaking again. "Every payment I've made until now, every transfer, every loan, was given out of love, out of hope that one day you might see me, but this envelope represents the end of that cycle. You will never have this power over me again." Relatives shifted in their chairs, exchanging uneasy looks. Some studied the envelope as though it were radioactive. Others glanced between me and Sophrona, realizing the symbolic weight of what lay inside. This isn't money, I thought. It's my freedom sealed in paper. In America, money has always been more than bills and numbers. It is control. In families, it becomes a chain, sometimes disguised as generosity, sometimes twisted into guilt. Tonight, I was taking back every link in that chain. I straightened and spoke directly to her, my tone firm without rising. "The Bank of Elizabeth," I said slowly, "is permanently closed. No more loans, no more rescues, no more silence." Her face contorted, shock and fury blending into desperation. "You can't mean that," she said sharply. "Family helps family." I shook my head, my voice unwavering. Family doesn't exploit one and crown the others. Family doesn't erase a daughter while draining her dry. That isn't love. That isn't family. Gasps rose again. Aviana's face drained of color. My father's lips trembled as he whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I should have protected you." His voice broke on the last word. His head dropped, shoulders shaking as he wept quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting his admission sink in. The sorrow it carried was sharp, but not enough to undo what had been done. His silence had cost me years. His guilt would not restore them. When I opened my eyes, I scanned the table, seeing the faces that had looked past me for so long. Now they looked at me differently, not as invisible, not as a background character in someone else's story, but as a force they could no longer deny. I reflected on what brought me here. The photographs that had erased me, the jokes about my playful career, the sacrifices stolen and handed to others like trophies. My chest rose as I steadied my thoughts. Tonight isn't about revenge, it's about survival. I will not die invisible in the home I helped sustain. A phrase I once read rang true now. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow. I had allowed their erasure too long. Tonight was the last lesson, and it was mine to teach. The liberation was bittersweet. The cost was losing them, not just the illusions, but perhaps the very ties themselves. Yet the reward was greater, reclaiming myself. For once, I didn't need them to see me. I saw myself, and that was enough. I pushed the envelope across the table one last time, the paper sliding like a blade cutting clean through years of lies. Then I rose, standing tall, my shoulders squared. Sophrona's face was pale now, drained of the power she wielded so easily hours earlier. Her lips parted in protest, but no words came. I leaned forward, my whisper slicing through the quiet. "Respect," I said firmly, "is the only currency I accept now." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer mine to carry. And as I turned to leave, I knew the real ending hadn't come yet. The final reckoning was still to follow. The white envelope still lay in the center of the table, its edges stark against the polished wood. No one reached for it. No one dared. It sat like a verdict, impossible to ignore. The air around us was thick, heavy with the recognition that something irreversible had just been spoken into existence. Sophrona sat frozen, her carefully crafted mask cracked and useless now. The relatives murmured to each other, whispers sharp as knives, and every whisper sliced at her reputation rather than mine. My fiancé leaned close, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "You've said enough. Now show them you mean it." I inhaled slowly, letting his words settle. Words ended the lie, but action would end the control. The cold resolve coursing through me no longer felt like rage. It was clean, like winter air in my lungs. This was not vengeance. This was closure. For decades, I had been locked in the role of caretaker, scapegoat, invisible provider. Tonight, I would break that lock. Sophrona tried one final attempt, her voice trembling with a desperation she couldn't disguise. "Elizabeth, don't do this. We're family." I met her gaze with a steadiness she could not match. Family doesn't erase one of their own. Her eyes flickered, searching for sympathy, but none came. Around the table, relatives averted their eyes, some shaking their heads. Aviana sat in silence, shame pulling her shoulders forward. My father lowered his face into his hands again, unable to look at me, weighed down by guilt so heavy it bent him. The room pulsed with the reality of her downfall. In American families, reputation is currency, and hers had collapsed in real time before the very people she had cultivated as her loyal audience. Recovery would be impossible. Once the curtain tears, no stitching can make the performance believable again. I reached into my purse once more. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic. When I drew it out, the chandelier's light caught it and threw a glint across the room. I placed the spare house key on the table, right beside the envelope. The clink of metal on wood resonated like a final gavel strike. Gasps circled the room again, though softer this time. Everyone understood the symbolism. Years ago, I had given Sophrona that key so she could come into my apartment whenever she pleased. It had been an extension of trust, of access, of obligation. Tonight, I severed it. "You no longer have access to my home," I said evenly. "Or my money, or my life." Her face went pale, lips parting in shock. "Elizabeth." Her voice cracked. "Please." I didn't flinch. "Respect is the only currency I accept now, and you've run out." The key gleamed under the chandelier like a final exclamation point. Relatives leaned back in their chairs, none of them daring to interfere. They all understood. This was not a gesture of anger. It was an act of liberation. For years I had begged silently for dignity. Tonight I was taking it without permission. I turned, taking my fiancé's hand in mine. His grip was steady, proud, unyielding. Together we walked toward the door. Behind me, Sophrona's voice cracked again, weaker this time. "Elizabeth, wait!" But the plea held no power. The authority in her tone was gone, replaced by fear, by emptiness. I kept walking. I glanced back once, just long enough to see my father's face, lined with regret, broken with the knowledge of his silence. But I did not falter. The door opened, and winter air rushed in, cold and clean. It brushed against my skin like a baptism. Outside, the snow reflected the glow of the street lamps, casting a soft light that wrapped around me as I stepped onto the porch. The sound of the door shutting behind me felt like a final seal. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. In every American story worth telling, walking away isn't just leaving, it's reclaiming. It's saying that freedom, even at the cost of family, is worth more than 1,000 hollow dinners, where love is conditional. I paused on the walkway, the crisp night filling my lungs, and whispered to my fiancé, "I'm not leaving family behind. I'm leaving behind the illusion of it." He squeezed my hand. Inside, I felt the clarity of rebirth. I walked out useless in her eyes, but whole in my own. And for the first time in my life, freedom didn't feel like loss. It felt like home.